Hi, everyone. It's Danielle, executive editor of Fine Gardening Magazine. Thank you so much for being a loyal podcast listener. We wanted to let you know that we have an amazing holiday deal going on for Fine Gardening Magazine subscriptions. If you're not already a subscriber to Fine Gardening Magazine and you love the podcast, it's a natural fit for you to start subscribing to our print magazine, where we give you all the great plant recommendations that you hear on the podcast and more. Right now, for the holiday season, if you go to www.finegardening.com, you'll find an offer for $15 for an entire year of Fine Gardening Magazine. Now, this holiday sale won't last forever, so hop on to finegardening.com to get a full year of Fine Gardening Magazine for $15. Happy holidays! Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants.
But not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I'm a senior editor at Fine Gardening.
And I'm Danielle Sherry. I'm the executive editor at Fine Gardening. And no, you don't need to adjust your volumes. I have the happy holidays head cold. So sorry for my voice, but we're going to get through it here today, Carol, because we had such an amazing topic to talk about that we did not want to delay it. I'm going to let you take the reins on it. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about great host plants. And I think, am I correct that neither one of us has done milkweed, Danielle?
No,
Okay.
I did not do milkweed.
So when we think about host plants, I think that's the one that everyone thinks of. Oh, we have to save the monarchs, we have to plant milkweed, but monarchs are not the only insect in our backyard environments. There are many, thousands and thousands of other insects. And I think it's kind of weird that people think of insects in categories: beneficial, pests. They're just trying to get along in this world, same as the rest of us, and we can help with the plants that we use in our garden. So today we're going to be talking about host plants. So not necessarily just nectar, but what do the caterpillars eat?
Right.
Is that a pretty good
Oh my
summation?
God, nailed it. Totally
Okay.
nailed it. Yeah. And I feel like, as gardeners, we're just, predisposed to think holes in leaves are bad. Holes in leaves aren't bad. If you want to save the planet and protect the pollinators, that butterfly starts out as a caterpillar that puts holes in your plants, and you just have to be good with it. And I think the plants, for the most part, that I saw you chose and I chose, these are all plants that are gonna be okay. They are used to being, munched on and eaten, and this isn't, a scenario where, oh, I'm gonna plant a plant for one season, the caterpillars are gonna eat it to death and kill it. No, these are plants that are, almost biologically predisposed to be munched on, and they will rebound the next year, sometimes even within the same season, and you're good to go.
Yes, and part of that same picture too is those caterpillars are delicious to somebody else. Birds
Yes.
harvest caterpillars all spring long to feed their babies, and so even if you have caterpillars on your plants, they're not all going to stay there because the birds will not let that happen.
Good point. Very good point. All right. Well, with that being said, what is your first host plant that popped onto your list?
So the caterpillars and insects that we're trying to encourage are native, but my first plant is not a native plant, and it's parsley.
Oh,
Plain old garden parsley, Petroselenium crispum. It's a biennial, which is hardy through the winter in zones 2 to 9, so pretty much anybody can grow this. Um, the reason I wanted to highlight this plant is, like, literally anybody can grow this, right? If you had a window box, you can stick it in there. It's available like in the grocery store, as seedlings in every spring. Like, it's easy to get, it's cheap. full sun, give it plenty of water if you want to actually eat parsley. Otherwise, it's pretty drought tolerant, actually. Fertile, well-drained soil, easy from seed, takes 6, if you want it to be, good going when the pollinators come around, 6 to 8 weeks before average last frosts when you plant it indoors. But plant plenty of it because it is a host plant for the eastern black swallowtail butterfly, that's Papilio polyzenes. That's also called the American swallowtail or the parsnip swallowtail, and that is a species found throughout most of North America, from southern Canada down to South America, most common in the United States east of the Rocky Mountains. But this is a butterfly that we have all probably seen in our gardens, and it loves host plants from the carrot family, Apiaceae, which has 2,500 to 3,000 different species.
So, is that all? Okay.
Right.
All right. Why don't you list them all off, Carol, for the listeners?
It's one of those pan global families, which explains why parsley, which comes from the Mediterranean, is a host plant for this native butterfly, because this butterfly isn't very fussy about its host plants, but it does particularly seem to like parsley. But it'll go on dill, fennel, carrots, celery, parsnips, hence parsnip swallowtail, and native hosts like cucumber magnolia, which our guest Uli Lorimer covered a few episodes ago, and golden alexanders, which are Zizia aurea. So magnolia cuminata and Zizia aurea are also host plants for this swallowtail butterfly. Fun fact about this eastern swallowtail butterflies: parasitoid flies and wasps will prey on the caterpillars, and so they will fling their poo. So because that's the smell of it draws in the flies and wasps. So you will see the caterpillars, and I put a photo in the show note of what these caterpillars look like when they get into your parsley, but you will not see the frass. Which is the giveaway for a lot of caterpillars. Like if you get caterpillars in your cabbage, you will know it by the frass before you see the caterpillars. But they're so pretty too. I love these caterpillars, and like once they get on my parsley, I'm like, okay, it's yours. It's I can go to the store and get parsley for me. But it is just so much fun. They've got, they're stripy like the monarch caterpillars that everybody loves. They've got personality. They sort of change from the tiniest instar, which is mostly black, and then by the time they are almost ready to pupate, they've got like stripes of green and like yellow. They're just so cool looking. So, a totally great excuse to grow some parsley.
And a low cost plant. So, you're even if you do just plant it as a sacrificial plant, I mean, there's nothing, it's not a $24.99 perennial, right, which I like. That's perfect. Yes. We used to call it preschool parsley because in, a bunch of preschools and preschool gardens, when I was growing up, they would have parsley just for that reason, to attract the swallowtail caterpillars. And then, you'd read the Very Hungry Caterpillar book and go through the whole steps because you could watch them and that this isn't the case for all butterflies and moths, but they hatch, pupate, and then become the butterfly all in the same season. So that's also kind of cool as well. So we're off to a bang today. That's a good one, Carol. My first plant is a perennial. It is a Eastern North American native, and I will start off by saying that there are many different species. of Antenaria, which is field pussytoes or pussytoes. If this pussytoes isn't native to your area, because this is my native, there is definitely an Antenaria that is native to you where you're listening. But Antenaria neglecta, which is zones 3 to 7, I love a plant whose species name is neglecta. Like, that is my plant. That pretty much universally across the plant world means, I don't need a lot of care. You can stick me in really terrible conditions and I will still do great, which is exactly what this field pussytoes does. It's well-drained soil, very lean, full sun, to partial shade. You can give it a little bit of shade, but really just kind of does its own thing as a matting ground cover, about 8 inches tall and spreading to about a foot wide. But this is a very critical, important host for the painted lady butterfly. The caterpillars feed only on the summer or the late spring, early summer foliage, when the foliage is kind of more at that succulent stage. And the foliage is absolutely beautiful. It's this silvery kind of tufted basal leaves of a rosette that they create. And it really forms this impenetrable mat, which is, kind of an invaluable plant to have in the garden anyway. The area that I have this is out by my mailbox, so you can imagine what this plant goes through, and it still looks great. It gets hit by a snowplow. It gets all the salt dumped on it from, the winter time. It's not watered ever. I don't think I own a hose that goes that far. So, and it really, really does it's so beautiful. It's this sparkly, just gorgeous, silvery matte ground cover. It gets its name from the tufted white flowers in spring that it gets, that are almost these like 5 little nubules that come up and kind of form a little discus, and they look like cat's paws if you look straight on at them. And that's kind of that's a signature look for the flowers across, regardless of the species. So any pussytoes are gonna look like that, and hence that's why it's the common name. But yeah, aside from being a really critical host for that native painted lady butterfly, it's also deer and rabbit resistant. So I feel like, this is a plant that really, pays for its place in your garden. It's a critical host plant. It doesn't get browsed by, some of the worst pests out there, which are not caterpillars, that are, 4-legged foes like deer and rabbits. And just a really, really tough plant. Over time, if you plant several of these, space them out about a foot apart or so, they will form colonies. So if you've got a neglected area, actually, I'm thinking about it, this would be a great plant for my hospital hill. I don't know why I ever thought of that before, but it will definitely work as like erosion control and an area that you could plant that it would stave off the weed penetration and really be a great plant for you. So again, that's field pussytoes. That's zones 3 to 7. Hey, zone 3, what's up? You always get mad at us for not including you, but here you are. And it's Antenaria neglecta. Look for a pussytoes that's native in your area, and it is likely a host plant for some sort of beneficial insect. Alrighty, Carol, what's up next on your list?
Okay, so my next one is a plant that I've been growing for a long time, and honestly, I was like, I'm going to look this up and see if it is a host plant. Mm-hmm. So that is sweet Joe Pye weed, Eutrochium purpureum, which I almost said eupatorium. It used to be eupatorium. I'm one of those people, and I'm old enough to remember when this was. Anyway.
Well, hang tight. It'll probably change another 3 times in our lifetime.
Right? Yeah. So Eutrochium purpureum, zones 4 to 9. Sorry, zone 3. But, actually, you might be able to get away with this one. Species is native to eastern and central North America. This is one of those, classic native plants. It gets really pretty big, so not everybody can grow it. 5 to 7 feet tall, 2 to 4 feet wide. But in late summer, it has these amazing mauve, pink, vanilla scented, fluffy flowers that just bring in the butterflies. And so it's valuable for wildlife for that alone. In fall, it goes to seed. The seeds feed the birds. But the leaves of this plant feed 41 species of caterpillars. So that's where the real value lies. And I'll be honest, like, I really don't notice when the leaves do, I guess, get a little ragged, but it makes plenty of leaves. They don't all get eaten up. But it is supporting, probably many of the insects that I see in my garden. And I never really even connected that. Over time, it will form a large clump of multiple plants, which can be divided out. And I just recently did that. I made a new garden in the wetland at one end of my property. This is a great wetland plant. That's its native habitat. But where I'm moving it from is a hell strip. So it does equally well in a dry upland location or in a spot where the soil is always wet. The difference that I notice is that in dry years it will get much smaller. Like this past summer was sort of, I don't know, record breaking, but we had some drought in Connecticut and it got about half the size that it normally would. It was shorter than me, which is short. But it still made, it still performed its ecological function. It made flowers. It attracted the pollinators and everything. And I'm sure it also was supporting those caterpillars. So it's deer resistant, but I have noticed that there's a certain point, around the time of the Chelsea Flower Show, folks, where it will just take back the new growth. And I just figure, well, they did the Chelsea chop for me. And nice. It makes it stay a little more compact, so it doesn't always reach that 7-foot tall mark, especially if the deer have been around, but they cannot put a dent in it. Like, they will never kill this plant. I started mine from seed, so that is possible. The seedlings are so incredibly tiny compared to the size of the parent plant. But if you do winter sowing, this is a great one for that, either in the jug or the Ziploc bag. I've seen multiple methods. You put it out so that the seed goes through the freeze-thaw cycle, and then those little seedlings can then be divided out in the spring. And eventually you'll have a plant that is 7 feet tall. Long-lived perennial. Like I said, I planted mine from seed 15 years ago, still have the original plant and have been dividing it out. And the last thing I'll say about this plant, it is a great substitute. It's like you've decided to kill your buddleia. You're like, okay, I get it. This is not good for the environment. If you take out a buddleia, put in Joe Pye weed. And if this one isn't native to where you are, Eastern and Central North America, there's a eupatorium or a eutrochium that is.
Yeah, I love that too because, a lot of people think that Joe Pye weed is just for moist and wet sites, but I love that you pointed out that yes, in these dry upland areas where you do have the buddleias, like it's been thriving in your hell strip. So yes. It's like a great substitute. So that's awesome. I love that plant. I truly love that plant. And also, like, does its thing at a time of year when the rest of the garden's kind of on the decline as far as flowering is concerned. So I think that's really cool. Big, very big, which is a great transition because I'm going to go big too. My next plant is cup plant. So it's Silphium perfoliatum. And that's zones 4 to 9. There's lots of silphiums out there, and I feel like we should probably preview. We're going to be doing a Richard Hockey article coming down the pike here in 2026. That is, or 2025, I forget. One of the two. It's going to hit soon-ish. In a year, we'll say. But he did a trial on cup plants, silphiums, and the photos in the show notes are from when I went out and I checked out that trial out in Chicago. And what a cool native plant. I feel like they're going to do what they did to Joe Pye weed and figure out that the genetics in this genus are actually separated out, because silphiums will be, cup plants can be everything from like arrow-shaped leaves that are fuzzy and silver to really dissected, almost holly-like giant leaves that are very succulent, and everywhere in between. But the one that I chose is just the straight cup plant, or giant cup plant it's sometimes called, and it's a host for the silphium moth and the giant Eucosima moth, both of which are really, really important pollinators to the prairie. Which makes sense because silphiums are native to the prairies of Midwest and southern United States. So this is a prairie plant. It's tall, like 4 to 8 feet tall. So even on a bad day, it's taller than me. And it gets about 1 to 3 feet wide. So just a very stately, towering, back of the border plant. Does not need any moisture. It will tolerate well-drained soils, but much like your Joe Pye weed, it will also do well in wet clay soils, which is, kind of indicative of the Midwestern areas who have that really tough to plant in clay soil that doesn't drain super, super well. So it takes a whole range of soil types. As I said, it's tall, it's showy. It has these large lance-like leaves that kind of curl up on themselves and then unfurl. So that curled up leaf is a cup, and hence its common name cup plant, and does actually gather water in the cup portion, the palm portion of the plant, and it siphons that water down the plant, that tall, 8-foot tall plant, and down to the base to feed the roots. So it really is very smart, just a very smart plant, that when it's needing moisture and it's gone dry, that this is how it gets more moisture. Even if you think about, dew settling on it, if there hasn't been a lot of rain, it will siphon that water down to the root system through that cup-like leaf system. I believe it's usually midsummer, mid to late summer, all the way through into the fall, it gets these gorgeous yellow daisy-like flowers that are up on these tall stems. So that's sometimes what extends the height up to 8 feet tall, is that these, rocket ships of yellow daisy-like flowers shoot up through the center. Full sun, I already said, you gotta put this back in the border because, it definitely is something that is quite tall, but sturdy. And that's pretty unbelievable because the stems are actually hollow, but they're very girthy and hollow. I mean, almost bamboo-like, which feels wrong to say in the same breath as a native plant. Talk about an invasive bamboo, but very much like that. And an interesting fact is that leafcutter bees love to use the stems as nesting sites. They're some of their favorite nesting sites. So that's another beneficial aspect of this cup plant. So I put a photo, and I think I didn't say how big the leaves are, but the leaves are about an average of 8 inches long and 5 inches across. So, that's big. So I put a couple of photos in the show notes of this plant, and one is of it in its full glory, the upright, almost 8-foot tall plant in full bloom, cup plant, looking gorgeous. And then the other photo that I put is of a leaf, the underside of one of the leaves, and it's got a bunch of eggs on it, moth eggs on it, and they're bright red and beautiful, so you can actually see the host plant doing its thing, and then aphids feeding on those eggs or feeding around those eggs, because the aphids probably aren't eating the eggs. They're probably sucking out the, whatever is happening with the leaf. But then a couple of photos later, which I'm not going to post because they were blurry, but then there were some ladybugs that moved in and then started feasting on the aphids. So it was like, full nature in bloom on this one leaf that was about 8 inches tall, and it was just such a cool experience. So I can vouch for this actually is a host plant because I got to see the whole hosting in action a couple summers ago when I visited this beautiful cup plant out in the Chicago Botanic Garden. So that is Silphium perfoliatum, zones 4 to 8. Pick it up. It's cool. Moving right along in host plant city, what you got for me?
Okay, so I've got one that I do not know would make our list for any other episode.
Meaning it's fugly?
No, I don't think so, actually. But this is a plant. I'm going to set it up a little. This is a plant that if I'm in somebody's garden, in the function of a fine gardening editor, and I got my camera in my hand, people will be a bit embarrassed that this plant is there. They'll be like, oh, yeah, I let a little of that go. And it's Virginia creeper. Uh-huh. And that's, now you say, oh, yeah, okay. It's because, you cannot help but grow this if you are in the, eastern woodlands, certainly. But it has a huge native range. It's native to eastern and central North America, parts of Mexico, and even Guatemala. So it's a grape relative, which I didn't know before I looked it up.
That kind of makes sense based on the leaf shape.
The leaf shape, the way it climbs, right? It's oh my goodness, okay. Here comes the botanical name. Parthenocissus Kincifolia. That part's not too bad. Parthenocissus. Zones 3 to 10.
Nice.
So, as anybody that has it knows, the vines can grow 20 to 50 feet in a single season. It clings to surfaces with adhesive discs on tendrils. And if it got anywhere near my house, my fine home building husband would, have a hissy fit, but it stays in the woods. It grows on trees. It grows on anything that is vertical, fences, whatever. But it'll also run along the ground, and when it does that, it kind of makes a nice ground cover. Mm. I think, the foliage is really quite attractive. It's a compound leaf, five leaflets, and it has amazing fall color. The photo I put in the show notes, it turns bright red. Just like poison ivy, which
I was just going to say, a lot of people mistake it for poison ivy, but it's leaves of 5, not leaves of 3.
It does, but some of those smaller leaflets will only have 3.
Oh.
Yeah, so you have to look at follow the vine, and if you don't find one with 5, then you might have poison ivy there. It doesn't help that some people get a skin reaction if they handle this plant, but it's not the same. It's not the urushiol oil, which is in poison ivy. It's some kind of little tiny spiny bits that are in or on the leaves somehow. So those are 2 strikes against it. A, looks like poison ivy. B, grows in the same habitat that poison ivy does, and C, you actually can get a reaction if you're going after this with bare hands and you rub it against your face. I don't know, just don't do that.
Don't do that.
But do let it go, because it has berries for the birds, and it is the host of several species of native moths, including Abbott's sphinx moth, Pandora sphinx moth, Virginia creeper sphinx moth, go figure, white-lined sphinx moth, and it supports many generalist caterpillars as well. And those huge long vines, don't think of them as invasive, think of them as successful, and they're making tons of leaves for those caterpillars. The birds are eating the caterpillars. Everybody's happy. tiny flowers in early summer. You will probably not even notice them, but they do provide nectar for certain pollinators, and maybe not the big showy butterflies and whatnot, but the flies are pollinators too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I say don't be embarrassed if you have this growing in your landscape. Give it some space and let it do its thing. And it really is pretty good about, staying out of the way of other plants, especially if you redirect it. If it's growing up your favorite shrub, you can pull it off and put it on something else or put it on the ground and it will be just fine.
And it's a wonderful whack-a-mole. Like it takes to, like you can literally, if you want to, with a string trimmer, just go at it just to get it like a little more contained. There's an area that I've just let it go wild basically, and just come along, and when it gets a little too big for its britches, just whack it back and it's fine. It's totally fine. So I think it's pretty. I think it's very, very pretty. And you know what? There's also some nativars that they've done some breeding on it on Parthenocosis to get some more like ornamental, a little bit more, manageable, if you will. So we featured one in our new plant section a couple years ago. So there's something to be had there, definitely.
Yeah, just like think of it like teeny little itty bitty Rogersias.
Yeah.
Kind of looks like that.
Yeah, for real, definitely. Well, that's funny because I feel like you're just like you're lining me up for the pitches here, Carol. Because my next plant is also a vine that can be a little zealous. I'll go with zealous, not overzealous, just zealous. And that's Bigleaf pipevine. So that's Aristocolia macrophylla, zones 4 to 9. There's lots of pipevines. Lots of pipevines out there. Lots of native pipevines, some non-native pipevines too that are more of the tropical persuasion, but this is the Eastern North American native, so that's the macrophylla, and it is an awesome plant. It is just an awesome plant. We had a former associate editor who was, hi Michelle if you're listening, who had this plant, and I remember the first time going over to her home and seeing this in her home garden and just being enthralled. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous vine. Giant heart-shaped leaves that are, bigger than, a medium-sized man's hand. I don't know how else to say it, but 5 to 8 inches across, just beautiful, beautiful Kelly green leaves. A polite twiner, does its own thing, doesn't need its own support, but does not have those hairy tendrils that stick and suction cup themselves like our dear friend Virginia Creeper. A little more behaved in that, but definitely is robust. I think the common moniker that they use for most pipe vines is Dutchman's pipe, but that is very specific to a couple of different species, not necessarily this one. Everybody throws it out there as the common name though, and that's because it gets a beautiful little, scratch that. It's not super beautiful. It's really freaking weird looking. It's a very odd looking, we'll just leave it at that. Go to the show notes and see a picture of it. But it looks like a pipe. It's a little insignificant flower that comes out in late spring that tends to be on the like greenish yellow and then kind of fades to a brownish color, brownish maroon color. But it's really those leaves. And it's the leaves that attract the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, which this is a very unique host for that particular butterfly, obviously, pipevine swallowtail. And they devour the leaves. They definitely devour the leaves. But because this vine is so robust, you will notice kind of that, it looks like a shotgun shot scattered across some of the leaves, but it doesn't these caterpillars don't defoliate the entire vine. Even a younger vine, they don't go that much to town. But I have this vine growing on a porch railing, basically a back end of my deck, and I've been able to keep it to about 4 feet tall, and its expanse is about 15 feet wide. If you just let this go, it would be about 15 by 15, this vine. It's very robust. It gets very, very woody, but I just prune the you-know-what out of it each spring so it kind of stays in check and stays where I put it, and it does really well. I just love in late spring, early summer, flipping over the leaves, and you'll see a photo in the show notes that I've flipped over a leaf, and you see these alien caterpillars, just totally alien. They start out, the larva starts out very, very black, almost looking black and wormy and a little bit of bumps on it. But as the caterpillars mature, they get these bright orange spots on them that kind of protrude out, so they look like multiple orange antennae. And I mean, you think it's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers coming, but so cool. And they bulk up very quickly. I would say from the time that I notice the young, juvenile larvae to when these caterpillars pupate on the vine is maybe 3 weeks. It's very, very quick. And then it's so great because then 3 to 4 weeks after that, generally end of summer, beginning of fall here in the Northeast, they hatch, and it is the most beautiful butterfly. It is black with an iridescent, burn your eyeballs blue, and a little bit of orange on that butterfly. It has the typical swallowtails, which are those droops that come off the bottom wings that kind of look like just dripping iridescent black, and it's spectacular, absolutely spectacular. So I love this plant. It's partial shade. You can apparently put it in full sun. It might need a little more water, especially in some warmer ends of its zone if you're going to put it in full sun. I have it in partial to almost full shade, actually, on the north side of my house, and in well-drained soil. That's essential. Death to this vine, to this pipe vine, would be if you just planted it in a really soggy situation. So unfortunately, this particular species of pipevine struggles in clay. But again, it's another one of those, if this isn't your native pipevine, there are native pipevines to most of North America, so look up a species that would be good for you. But this one will do well, bigleaf pipevine in zones 4 to 9, and I love it. All right, Carol, we're nearing the end. Why don't you bring it on home for us? Neither one of us, have either one of us done a tree or a shrub?
No, and I don't have one. Although trees and shrubs are, let's just put it out there, great host plants because of the volume of plant material that they provide to caterpillars. But it's just hard to tell people to plant an oak tree. I
mean, hold on, because that's going to be, I've got one Good. Coming as my last plant, with that caveat though, that this is not going to be for everyone's, postage stamp front yard. But no, I'm glad, I feel like it's more accessible when you stick to perennials and annuals, because regardless of the size of your lot or container, balcony garden, you can still get away with these host plants.
Yes. So I have one that doesn't take up as much space as a tree, but if you're going to grow this one, you want to make sure you do have space for it, because this is not a decision that you can take back once you've planted it. And Warning. That's Passionflower, Passiflora incarnata, zones 5 to 11. It's much hardier than you might imagine. If you see pictures of this plant, it looks, especially in flower, it looks like the tropical passion flowers that just, oh my goodness, the complex flower. And apparently the missionaries had some kind of explanation how the different flower parts related to the Passion of Christ, and hence the name. But I haven't really sorted that out.
That's our other podcast, our religious history podcast that you can find on iTunes at a later date.
Right. Yes. But just, regardless of symbolism or whatever, just beautiful flowers. It's like, so it's just one of those aspirational plants, because like I have been afraid, honestly, to put this in the ground. But here's where I came down. When I found out that it is a host plant, a larval host for several butterflies, including the Gulf fritillary, variegated fritillary, zebra heliconian, I thought, okay, if I plant this in a spot where I've taken out invasive species like privet, burning bush, if I am putting something of ecological value in the place of those things, then I shouldn't worry that it's taking over an entire corner of my lot, which it will do. It grows about 25 feet tall and wide. It is a vine, as we had discussed. A vine can go in any direction. It can be, kind of act like a ground cover for a while and then go up a tree. So yeah, you want to make sure to plant it in a spot where it can do what it does, because it's going to do what it does regardless of whether you want it to or not. This is native to the southeastern, south central parts of the United States, plus Bermuda. And in the southern part of its range, the vines are perennial and will get big and woody. But in the northern part of its range, which I'm assuming would be us in zone 6, the vines will die to the ground. And I think that is helpful for those of us that don't want it to take over the world. It's moderately deer resistant. It likes full sun, partial shade, but it does, like a lot of vines, like to have its roots cool and moist. So if you're putting in a sunny spot, maybe some mulch on the roots will help with that. But if you give it supplemental moisture, it's going to like that. And, take that for what it will. If you completely abandon it, it will probably still grow like crazy. Root rot, though, is possible in wet soil. So you want to, put it in well-drained soil. Gulf fritillaries appear in January to November in the northern part of this range of this plant. That seems pretty cool. Throughout the year in southern Florida and Texas, variegated fritillary has 4 broods throughout the season, February to December in the southern part of the range, and 3 broods from April to October in the north. Zebra heliconian, not sure about how many broods it has, but I just, I'm reading about this, I'm thinking about that would be as exciting as the flowers. Yeah. And that's just another way to think of our plants is like, the interest doesn't have to come from foliage and flowers, it can come from the life that supports too. The edible fruit also have wildlife value. There are plenty of things that like the fruit, which are technically berries, and they pop when you step on them, which gives us the common name of maypops, which, I mean, come on now. That sounds like fun. And the other common name is apricot vine, so apparently the fruit have maybe an apricot flavor. I have never tried one. Anyway. So I am working up the courage, but I do have a spot where I think I could get away with planting this one.
I am with you because I feel like in the past year alone, we've had 2 of our regional reporters through All Access. Just so everybody knows, we've got, regions on our website where we have a reporter from a particular region that writes very specific articles to your backyard, all about plants they recommend. So we've had 2 regional reporters from 2 different regions just in the past year who have focused their articles on the native passionflower vines to that particular area. I think that it was the Pacific Northwest and the Southeast. Definitely, there might have even been another report, but I learned so much about them, and what a cool plant. I mean, Such a cool plant. And like you said, like all of these different various like beautiful aspects, edible fruit, gorgeous vine, beautiful flower. And now you're telling me that, one particular species of butterfly alone does 3 to 4 different broods on it. I mean, that's pretty cool. That is very cool. So we should link those Passionflower articles in the show notes now that we're on a Passionflower kick. That is very cool. Well, you could grow your Passionflower vine, Carol, up the trunk of a giant white oak, Quercus alba, zones 3 to 9. All right, listen. It's an oak tree. Okay, here we go. Secret's out. It's an oak tree. It gets big. Okay, so this is definitely, if you're just growing on a balcony, you're not going to be able to plant this plant. You could have a seedling and then find a home for it elsewhere once it gets bigger. But white oak is a big tree. It's going to get 50 to 80 feet tall and wide over our lifetime, maybe our kids' lifetime, let's be honest. It's a big tree, but I've just really leaned in specifically in the past couple of years. We've done a lot with Doug Tallamy, noted naturalist Doug Tallamy, who has really focused in on these keystone species. And these are native plants that just punch well above their weight class when it comes to their ecological value. So not only are they native plants, not only are they, leaning into supporting, a ton of different insect and wildlife, but these are species that are just, whoa, blow your mind. And the king and queen of the keystone species are oak trees. And oak trees alone, according to his research, support 897 different caterpillar species. I mean, that's absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, if you put it into perspective, a maple tree, which I feel like are just as ubiquitous, they support about 300 species. Still amazing, still incredible. But an oak tree is nearly 3 times that amount that they support. So, I've always loved, I grew up here in, the northeast of North America, and I've always loved white oak trees because they are so beautiful. They have that beautiful, very standard, iconic oak leaf, but is more rounded and lobe-like, and in a very, very bright Kelly green color, as opposed to, kind of a more dark and moody green of some red oaks or something along those lines. It also has a spectacular bark, and that's why it's a white oak tree, because it has this white, silvery, almost ash-like bark to it, which is very, very attractive. But something that I got super, super excited about just this past spring is, bear with my story here, kids. Get yourself settled in for my yarn. We had a terrible epidemic of gypsy moth caterpillars that really wiped out a very large portion of our mature oak trees in the eastern U.S. a few years ago. And it was back-to-back years. So they completely defoliated the oak trees in year 1. If the oak trees struggled to come back in year 2, they got completely defoliated again from this insect. And we lost a lot of them. As a matter of fact, that's why a lot of us lost power in the storms that came through those years, because these oak trees were dying off. And that was a lot of our hardwood forest was completely decimated, and now are standing dead oak trees everywhere. So we thought, oh, that's it. Like, wow, that's really sad. A ton of oak trees, all of those caterpillars lost their host plant. Well, this year, a few years later, we had beech leaf disease that moved into the native forests, and there are beech trees dying left and right. And I've just been noticing more and more that, these heavily wooded areas are bright, open, sunshiny spaces now. And it is shocking and really, really sad. But one bonus has been, we happen to, 2 years ago, have a bumper crop of acorns. We had an acorn year, and the oak trees that were left dropped a ton of acorns. And this past spring, I was hiking and around the outskirts of my property in all of these areas that the beech trees have now opened up the canopy, have been white oak tree nurseries, and there's tons and tons of little white oak tree saplings that have really sprung up. And, it was the one bright spot after several years of, an invasive disease and an invasive pest wiping out much of our hardwood forest. It probably is not going to be in my lifetime that it'll be regenerated, but there's a ton of life now at the forest floor, and I'm super excited about it. So I got so excited I took a video, which we will put in the show notes, of just at my feet in this one little area on the corner of my yard, just probably 50 little white oak tree saplings. So I would recommend, if you have the space, plant an oak tree. Maybe it's not a white oak, maybe that's not the oak that's, native to your area, but it's definitely worth planting an oak tree. I will go one step further, in talking with Doug, telling me there are oak trees now that are nativars, that are a little more dwarf, that stay a little bit smaller in habit. So if you don't have the space for an 80 by 80 tree, there are options that stay more in the 20 to 30 range. Plant an oak tree. It's definitely a host plant that punches way, way, way above its weight level as far as supporting wildlife. And 800 plus species of caterpillars. And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter to talk about his New Year's resolution.
Happy holidays, dear listeners. I trust your recent celebrations have gone well, and you're looking forward to a happy and healthy 2025. I know I am. I'm extending that sentiment of happiness and health to my garden next year as well. I used to get so frustrated when I'd walk out and find holes in the leaves of my plants. The crisp perfection ruined. I'd grab my phone and Google organic solutions for X and wage war, convinced I was saving my garden. But then I read something in a fine gardening article by John Gwynn, something that changed everything. Mr. Gwynn proclaimed his garden goal was a hole in every leaf. Holes in leaves? They're signs of life, he said. Proof that my garden isn't just for me. It's a feast for caterpillars, a nursery for butterflies, a home for moths. And those caterpillars? They're not all pests. They're pollinator larvae, the next generation of beauty and balance. So I've embraced a New Year's resolution. A hole in every leaf. I want this place to hum with life. To be more than just a pretty picture. More host plants, less perfection. More space for hungry little insects to do their thing. This isn't just my garden anymore. It's theirs too. Yes, the perfectionist in me is going to have to learn to love the mess, the nibbled edges. But I'll try to recondition myself to see that these are leaves with stories. So let them come. Let them eat. This garden is open for feasting.
Well, Carol, I think that's pretty exciting that Peter's resolution is holes in every leaf of his garden.
Yes, that should be all of our resolutions.
You're right, it should be. I bet you it's the resolution of our experts. So let's see what they have to say about holes in leaves. Are they pro or against?
Hey, thank you so much for having me. My name is Cheyenne Wine, and I am a gardener in Richmond, Virginia, Zone 7B. I am a huge advocate for native plants, native insects, and just promoting biodiversity. I have worked at plant nurseries doing a variety of different things, and now I work to promote conservation efforts at the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. I have a double standard when it comes to insects eating the plants in my garden. When Japanese beetles start destroying my hibiscus and half the other plants in my yard, it sends me into a rage. And yet, when I see monarch caterpillars eating my milkweed almost to the ground, I'm ecstatic. I'm crawling through the mulch, looking under each leaf, taking pictures, texting my mom about it. And the reason for this dichotomy is because one of those things is supposed to happen, and the other one is not. Invasive species and the loss of habitat have caused significant declines in our populations of native insects. And if you would like to help undo some of that, Or even if you just want to see more of these insects in your garden, like butterflies and moths, then you don't need a nature preserve to do that. Really, all you need is a flower bed. So that's what I'm here today to help with. I have got some host plants that are for mostly some of the smaller, cute species of butterflies and moths that tend to be overshadowed by some of their larger, flashier relatives. And at the same time, these are host plants that have some ornamental value. So they look nice and they're going to perform well in a smaller, cultivated space. Our first host plant is Chasmanthium latifolium, or northern sea oats or river oats. This is a host plant for several species of skipper butterflies, which are the small, fuzzy sort of butterflies that dart around and zigzag and zip through the air real fast. This is a perennial grass that's hardy to zones 5 through 9. It reaches about 2 to 3 feet in height and about 3 feet wide. It can be grown in sun or light shade. Personally, I think this is one of the prettiest grasses that you can have in your landscape. It's got wide blades and really fine, delicate stems, and then these wide, flat oats that sort of nod and hang down and sway in the breeze. It's very rustic and charming. And as the season progresses, the plant turns from green in color into this really pretty gold. Not only does it feed the larvae of skipper butterflies, but it's also good for a lot of other wildlife as well. It's good for providing coverage for small mammals and birds. It provides nesting materials for birds and seeds for so many different creatures to eat. In terms of using it in a landscape, it's pretty versatile. So it thrives in moist to wet soils, but it can tolerate drought. It can tolerate pretty much anything after it's established. So it's a really good candidate for erosion control, or planting along riverbanks, in rain gardens. I've even heard of people who plant it en masse near their pool. One thing to keep in mind is it does reseed very easily. So it will spread over time, which doesn't bother me personally because I love having alive this plant. I think it's beautiful. But if you need to, it does transplant very easily. Next up is Hypericum prolificum, or shrubby St. John's wort, which is the host plant for several species of insects, including the gray hairstreak butterfly and the wavy-lined emerald moth. Now that's a really unusual one because the wavy-lined emerald moth has caterpillars that take pieces of flowers and stick them on their backs as camouflage to help protect them from predators, which I think is so cool. Hypericum prolificum is a shrub that is usually deciduous but can be evergreen depending on where you live. It is hardy to zones 3 through 8. The height and width, like most other shrubs, really depends on how you prune it and if you prune it, but eventually it can reach about 5 feet high and wide. The important thing to understand about this shrub is that it is slow growing. So this is not a good candidate, in my opinion, for like a privacy hedge that you want to fill in really quickly and grow really tall. But it is nice as like a structural plant in your flower beds, or maybe in a privacy border that's like a mixed planting. The advantage of this plant is that it's so adaptable. It can be grown in full sun to light shade, and pretty much any soil type, whether it's moist or dry soil, or sandy or rocky soil, clay soil, It can handle pretty much everything, so it's going to be compatible with a lot of spots in your landscape. It can tolerate drought, it can tolerate brief flooding. So even though, yes, it does take a while to do what it's doing, it's dependable and it's a plant that you can have around for years and years. In summer, it becomes covered in these bright yellow, sort of button-shaped flowers that are super appealing to pollinators. And it has a fair bit of late season interest as well. In fall, it starts to take on yellow and orange shades, and it develops brown seed pods that will last well into winter. Next, we have Senna hebecarpa, or wild senna, or American senna, which is a host plant for many types of sulfur butterflies, which you've probably seen before. They're bright yellow, sort of hard to miss. This is a perennial, technically a legume, that is hardy to zones 4 through 8. It reaches about 5 feet in height and about 3 feet in width. It is a sun-loving plant that will thrive in average to moist soils. This is one that I would really like to see in more landscapes because it's very prolific. It gets these big golden flower clusters in summer that attract lots of pollinators, and they're oriented more towards the top of the plant. So it can slot nicely behind shorter perennials in a flower bed. It has a horizontal root system, which helps give it stability and keep it upright in severe winds. So though it's kind of a tall plant, it doesn't struggle with flopping as much as it could. Later in the season, it develops long black seed pods, which are food for a lot of animals, including turkeys. Now, Senna hebecarpa is very similar to Senna marylandica, or Maryland senna. In my mind, functionally, they are the same plant. So I think this information really applies to both of them, and if you can source either of those species, I think they would be worth giving a try. All three of those plants were host for smaller species of butterflies and moths that we don't tend to talk about as often. So you'll have to give me a pass for this last one because I'm going to talk about milkweed. Monarch butterflies have one host plant, which is milkweed or Asclepias. They're not compatible with any other plant. So although there's been a huge surge in awareness about the decline of the monarch populations in recent years, and there's been a big push to get milkweed into more gardens, I think it's still important to talk about it. Though I do want to introduce you to a type of milkweed that maybe you're not familiar with, and that's Asclepias purpurescens, or purple milkweed. It is perennial, hardy to zones 4 through 9. It reaches about 3 to 4 feet in height and no more than 2 or 3 feet wide. It can be harder to find than other types of milkweed, and that may be because it's a little more finicky. It is not as drought tolerant, I've noticed, as some of the other species, and it's also not as aggressive as, say, common milkweed or Asclepias syriaca. So it can struggle to hold its own against more aggressive plants. So it can take some finesse to keep this plant going from year to year, but I think it is absolutely worth it. And that's because this is one of the prettiest milkweeds I have ever seen, or maybe one of the prettiest flowers in general. It's got these bright, saturated purple flowers that hold a nice spherical shape, and they are just as attractive to monarchs and other pollinators. If you want this plant to succeed in your garden, I would plant it in moist, well-draining soil in sun to light shade. And if you live in a hot climate, I would give it more shade in the afternoon just so it doesn't dry out as quickly. But I hope you have success with it. I will continue to keep working with it in my own yard and experimenting because it's such a lovely plant. And again, helping monarchs is so important to me. As I mentioned, I'm in Virginia, so these are all plants that are native to the eastern US and some of them parts of the central US. You can find the native range for these and any other native plants by going to the USDA Plants database and searching by the botanical name. And that's going to pull up a range map of every state and even county where that plant is native to, which is very helpful because when you're planting host plants, you want to choose things that will thrive in your region and also be useful to the insects there. If you're not in the same area that I am, don't worry because there's no shortage of host plants. Your state probably has its own resources or a native plant society that can hook you up with good host plants for your area. Thank you so much again for having me and letting me talk on and on about bugs and the plants they like. I really hope this information is useful to someone out there.
Well, Carol, as we close out another year of happy podcasting, I think that this was a great one to end on with a resolution to plant more host plants, not get freaked out about all the leaves that have holes in them in our gardens, and to not be so perfect.
Absolutely. Order yourself some host plants as a New Year's gift. That would be a gift for you and for your habitat.
Love it.